Okay, brilliant. So welcome to the first webinar of Empower Period, which is really exciting. We're going to start by basically the aim of today. So the aim of today is that we all want to know how to assess the needs of our individual communities during the pandemic, especially in relation to vulnerable groups of women, girls, young people, and people with periods. The structure for the session, we're going to use a structure where we go through the situation as it stands, the background to the situation, the assessment that you can do of your community, and then the response that you can put into action. So if we start with the situation as it stands, obviously we're in a pandemic at the moment with coronavirus, COVID-19. So that means that most countries are in quarantine, on lockdown. I know that obviously we are in the UK. In Uganda, we're also experiencing that with a military enforced lockdown, where people are not allowed to leave their homes. And this sort of self-isolation, this quarantine, is causing a lot of issues for groups who may not have considered themselves being vulnerable, but also groups who have previously been vulnerable anyway. So if we think about quarantine and how this is working, the risks that this is putting to girls and women are limited access to products and services. So that includes menstrual products, but also contraceptives as well, because people can't just go directly to their GPs. They can't go and have their coils fitted, etc. Also services as well, access to services is proving to be incredibly difficult. For example, safe abortion is limited. Also, if we think about women and girls, especially in the UK and beyond, they face the burden of care for the family. So many women, single mums, single parents, are really facing the issue of financially supporting their family, having enough food to feed their children, which often we think is an issue outside of the UK. But previous to quarantine, this has always been an issue of hunger in the UK, and it's continuing and it's worsening during the pandemic. And basically what we need to focus on and talk about is that even though during a pandemic, we need to focus on tackling that first, we don't have to ignore girls' and women's rights within that. Like, we have a choice to include women and girls and people with periods and their rights, and we can prioritize that amongst the pandemic. So if we think about sort of the vulnerable groups who we may want to be considering in our own communities, this is like a bit of an interactive part. If any of you guys want to think about particular vulnerable groups in your communities who you may want to consider, can you just like write it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and you can add to the conversation, and I'll read out the chat. So particularly vulnerable groups, obviously we have girls and women, of course. Homeless women, so Millie said homeless women, absolutely. Natalie said asylum seekers, yeah, definitely. Emily said women at risk of domestic abuse, yeah, absolutely. So part of the campaign that iRise are doing, oh, Emily has said calls have increased by 25%. Yeah, so obviously with the fact that we're being isolated and we're at home, domestic abuse is increasing for not just women, girls, children, everyone, which is incredibly difficult, and no one should have to stay at home with their abuser. Lizzie said people who have lost their jobs due to coronavirus. Yeah, Alfred said people living with disability. Sophie said, I'm finding people in my community with mental health problems, and those living alone and on benefits are struggling at the moment. Absolutely. Kerry said UK students who are getting period products at school. Yeah, so we do know that schools are still allowed to order period products, in the same way that they're still allowed to order free school meals. So one thing that we can all do to kind of tackle that is get in touch with your local schools and tell them, say that you can still apply for these free period products. So make sure you get them, and make sure you're targeting those vulnerable people that you know will most likely to need them. Millie said single parents. Emily single mothers with no support network don't know what to do if they are too ill to care for their children. Yeah, Natalie said people who are reliant on food banks prior to the pandemic. Yeah, because obviously the use of food banks has skyrocketed, and people who kind of didn't consider themselves being within that group are now in that group. Millie said key workers. Yeah, absolutely. Because there's obviously NHS workers who are also single parents, and who may also be ill during the pandemic. Linda, those classified as high risk and vulnerable who have to self-isolate for 12 weeks. Yeah, absolutely. And tying into that, what Sophie said about sort of mental well-being and health, that's something that we really shouldn't, we need to consider. It's really important, the fact that people are isolated, people are feeling lonely, and the impact that can have on your mental health and how exacerbated that is during this time. So Gemma said those who are shielding / highest risk, those with mental health issues, women in prisons. Yeah, absolutely. And Emily said, in Uganda, people can't even leave the house to get food. We're getting videos from mothers saying they can't feed their children. Yeah, so this is a common thing. I saw it on a Facebook group from another charity saying that they'd had some messages from single mothers saying they've got, 5 or 6 children and they can't feed them. So it's a widespread problem across the entire globe. So that's a really like good group of vulnerable people, really detailed. So thinking about all of those vulnerable groups, some of which were previously vulnerable, some of which are newly vulnerable, we need to make sure that we're protecting those people and we're providing the support that we can. So another thing that I don't think potentially was mentioned is LGBTQA plus people. That, especially along with domestic violence, can be a massive issue for that group at the moment, having to sort of quarantine with their families who might not be supportive of their lifestyle and their identity. So yeah, thinking about all of those things. So if we move on to, so that was the situation as it stands. So if we move on to our background, we've got our coronavirus response campaign. iRise have developed this response. Emily, I wondered if you wanted to talk about that, because I know you've been working on it. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so Emily's going to talk now.
Okay, let me just get that up. Okay, great. So I think at iRise we focused a lot on periods and period equality, but the reason we care about periods is it's because of power. It's because actually the neglect of periods is a sign of the massive power imbalance that exists in our society and in our world. And actually this kind of crisis, it exacerbates those power imbalances, so that people who have little power find that they have even less. And because they have less power, their needs are they're placed in an increasingly vulnerable situation where their needs are unnecessarily sacrificed in the crisis response. And I think we decided at iRise that our priority during this crisis needs to be on kind of ensuring provision, providing protection and restoring power to those most vulnerable groups. And because for us, that is at the heart of the work that we've always done on periods. And actually in this crisis, we think we can't just say, here's a pad. We've got to say, okay, this pad has always been for us a symbol of power. It's been a symbol of adjusting a systemic power imbalance. And so during this crisis, we need to really focus on the root, what that pad has always been symbolic of, which is trying to give power and empower the most vulnerable. So our interim strategy is around doing that in a more holistic way than we normally would, using our connections, our network, to work collaboratively to try and ensure that the most vulnerable don't have to unnecessarily sacrifice their basic rights, because the rest of the world is kind of is focused on this crisis response, which obviously we need to be, but actually we can do that, and we can do it with the most vulnerable being protected. So our campaign, I think Akusha already mentioned this, it's got these 3 strands around ensuring provision, providing protection, restoring power. And I'll just talk briefly about what we're hoping to do kind of underneath those. I think the important thing to say is that actually we do face a choice as a society. We can either abandon these most vulnerable groups and get on with kind of protecting ourselves, or we can make a choice to look after them and bring them with us. And I think that choice will leave a really long-lasting legacy. I think it's a really historic moment, and it will really define us as individuals and as a society. And so I think we need to make the right choice, and we need to make sure that we choose to protect the most vulnerable. And I think everybody can do that. Like, I don't think you need to have, I mean, at IRISE, we've always said you don't need to have traditional power, traditional institutional authority to take action. And actually we all have the power to take action to protect the most vulnerable. And that, I suppose that's what these webinars are going to be about, is about how to do that. So now talking about the 3 areas where we think we as a global community can take action. So the first one is around ensuring provision. So I think we must, as a community, ensure that vulnerable women and girls and other kind of vulnerable people have access to basic necessities. And that specifically for IRISE, we're talking about including gender-specific needs like menstrual products, contraception, access to safe abortion. And we must support caregivers, particularly the young single mothers in our network who are facing lockdown and don't know how they're going to feed their families. And that, you know, and we're not talking about abstract people, we're talking about women that we've worked with for a long time in Uganda, facing this sort of terrifying prospect, and also women down the road in the UK on my street sort of facing this really horrible situation. Under providing protection, I think we must enable women and girls facing abuse to seek and find refuge from their abusers. And I don't think anybody should have to spend lockdown with their abuser. And I think that there's a lot of things we can do there. And again, a lot of it is around working with other stakeholders, with local government, with local organisations to raise awareness and about how people can access help. And I'm actually talking to a few partners at the moment about how we might be able to do that. But there's also things that you'll be able to do immediately locally to support some of these kind of initiatives to make sure that nobody spends lockdown with their abuser. I think also under providing protection, a lot of women always across the globe face a disproportionate burden of care. And a lot of women will be informally caring for the sick and be at increased risk of infection. I know that's very true in East Africa. It's also true in the UK. And so we need to protect informal carers and make sure that people have the information and have whatever protection we're able to provide. And then finally, restoring power. And so I think we must empower women and girls and the other young people in our network to share their experiences so that we can find out what's happening, like what are the unintended gendered impacts of this lockdown. Because actually there's so little being reported and it's very difficult to know what's going on, and we need to create mechanisms where people can share. And I think we've set up our WhatsApp groups. We're getting a lot of videos and stories from Uganda coming through, but that we must continue to create those channels so that we know what's happening. Because actually there's a real risk that a lot of these abuses, a lot of these issues are only going to come to light months or even years after this pandemic, and we need to know now so that we can prevent them rather than after, when the damage has already been done. So we need to set that up and make sure we've got ways for people to share and that we're able to turn that into advocacy and advocate for these groups and advocate with them. So that's the kind of the focus areas of the campaign. And what we're going to be doing, what Akusha is going to be doing through these workshops, is helping us all think about what this means for us and what our role is within this campaign, how we can take action locally, how we can support this kind of broader initiative to make sure that what is becoming a girls' rights crisis doesn't kind of pass unnoticed. I'm done.
Thank you. That is like our main sort of coronavirus response campaign and strategy, which goes across the UK and also Uganda. We don't really need to separate the two because the crisis that women and girls and vulnerable groups are experiencing is shared. It's not something that we can distinguish between the two, really. And then so what we were planning on doing with this time was doing our Empower Period project, and we need to kind of utilise that to work on the coronavirus response campaign. Those two things can come together. So for the Empower Period project, it's focused around young people leading, young people deciding what's important to them, what's important in their communities, developing their own advocacy campaigns, and making real lasting social change that they themselves can do now. I think there's this, along with just the general iRise message, is that we don't have to wait for someone else to tell us that we can do something, and we don't have to think that we'll be able to lead, we'll be able to make change at some point in the future when we've got X, Y, and Z. We can do it now, and it is actually down to us as those who are passionate about these issues to bring this to light now, as Emily said, like tackle this now rather than waiting for it to be something that's already happened and something we can't do something about. So yeah, I think it's what this is for, is really to create this space where people will have the skills and the ability to act now, which we're all capable of doing, and we don't have to wait for someone to tell us to do so. I'm just going to read some of these comments. So Emily just said, in Uganda, people can't even leave the house to get food. We're getting videos from mothers saying they can't feed their children. Women also can't get their contraception in Uganda, and they have little control over their bodies normally, and abortion is illegal. So there's a high risk of unwanted pregnancy. So that really puts to home why we need to be making sure that women are getting access to the things that they deserve to have access to. And Gemma said, was just about to say LGBTQ. Gemma said, I'm seeing a huge increase in ableism during this pandemic, as well as the gender inequality being amplified. Gemma, would you mind just kind of explaining what ableism is? Thank you.
I've unmuted myself to do it.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So ableism is the prejudice and discrimination and, the kind of internalized systemic kind of anti-disabled ism. And in America I think it's called disableism, but in the UK we tend to call it ableism. But yeah, it's discrimination against people with disabilities, and a lot of that is internalized and institutionalized in the same way that things like racism and sexism. And yeah, it is pretty rife at the moment. You've got all of the stuff about people being asked to sign do not resuscitate orders, the whole debate about whether disabled people, even and elderly as well, ageism is pretty severe at the moment, about whether who's worthy of a ventilator and who's worthy of the extra healthcare at the moment, and that kind of prioritization of life. Even the stories and the way that the pandemic's kind of unraveled with, it was kind of in the beginning, it was like, oh, well, you're safe because it's only the unhealthy people and the disabled people and the elderly people that are going to get this and are going to be affected. So in that kind of scaremongering at the beginning, it was used in well, it doesn't matter because it's only this group of people that are going to, die, essentially, is how some papers were phrasing it. So yeah, it's pretty disgusting behaviour at the moment. So yeah, just to say that that's rearing its ugly head quite a lot at the moment.
Thank you so much for sharing that and explaining what that is. I think also to add to that, it's quite interesting how companies and organisations have so easily adapted to working from home.
Yes, definitely.
Which now is the norm, but previously it was always told that it wouldn't be possible. They can't facilitate that for disabled people, and it just proves that we have a choice. We can do things if we want to, and we prioritise them. So that's really important. Thank you so much for that.
No problem. I'll turn myself back off again.
Okay, feel free to chip in at any point. Okay, so Linda said, is there any scope for linking up with local community COVID-19 support groups? Yeah, so in our last network meeting, Linda attached a link to a website which was linking people to mutual aid groups within their communities. So these are people who are coming together who want to support their individual local communities with whichever issues they are specifically experiencing. I'll make sure that I send an email around to everyone that has that link on, because it's a really easy way to link up with people who are literally your next door neighbours who want to get together virtually and make a difference right now. So yeah, that's definitely something that we encourage you to do, is to look online, look on Twitter, look at Facebook. There's so many support groups out there who want to make change, and you will only add value to that. So Millie said, I've seen a lot of instances of bulk buying of sanitary products. Yes, so I know that I definitely, when I was last in Tesco, the shelves were pretty much empty, except for a couple of products which were for very sort of light flows. I know that a lot of people have been hoarding the heavier ones. Luckily, I think this issue is slightly easing because of the limitations of people only being able to buy a certain amount of products. So that's good that that's come into play. But even having said that, people are still experiencing an issue of access. And so ways that we can think about that are product drives, thinking about the best ways in which to create a community drop-off point for supplies, and how to think about getting those distributed to those who most need it. Emily said, so important to link to local support groups. We are doing that in South Yorkshire and hoping to help others to do the same in their area. Yeah, and Alfred said, we at Ruby Cup. So Alfred, I think is from Kenya, I think I'm right in saying. I know it's East Africa. So we at Ruby Cup are donating free Ruby Cups to health workers in Europe and Nairobi in Kenya. If you have any contacts in your local health facility and we would love to coordinate with this, please write to us, hello@rubycup.com. So that's incredible that health workers are getting those free products. So if anyone wants to sort of team up and ask Alfred more about that, the email is in the chat. I'll also send that round as well. Callum, hi Kushla, I can talk about community links if you need. Yeah, I think that would be really helpful, because I know that Callum's been doing some work, especially in South Yorkshire and Sheffield. Emily said, that's great, Alfred, there does seem to be a shortage of products. And there's a few more comments about local mutual aid groups. So Callum, do you want to have a talk about sort of what you've been doing in Sheffield?
I literally just stepped out to take a call after volunteering.
Okay, we'll come back to that.
Come back to him in like 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Sophie said, I'm a coordinator for my local mutual aid group, so can offer any advice for anyone else who wants to get involved in their local version. That's amazing. So thank you so much, Sophie, for saying that. So if anyone feels like they want to take a more leading role, feels like they know where to help, they feel like they have the time and the resources to give to their community, do get in touch with Sophie. Callum said, food banks are struggling to buy enough supplies from their usual suppliers, including sanitary pads. Yeah, Gemma said, some of our local product provision charities are struggling at the moment to do product drives because their volunteers are mainly female and have care responsibilities and or are key workers, plus the restrictions on products and availability of them causing extra problems. Yeah, that's something that I hadn't even considered, that a large majority of our network are female. And as Emily said, female do hold the burden of caring for the family. Okay, Callum is back. So does Callum just want to talk a bit about what he's been doing with mutual aid in his area?
Can I just add as well that this framework we set out at the start, so we've kind of covered the overall situation. We've talked a bit about the background in terms of our coronavirus campaign, how the Empowered Period Project is being adapted to support that campaign. I think we're now moving into the assessment part, which is thinking about how we look at and understand specific community need. And I think Callum's example will hopefully almost be like a case study that other people can use to think about how they go through a similar process in their own area, and then can come back to us with ideas that we can then support. So while he's speaking, think, oh, how can I adapt this? How can I use this in my own area? And then come back to iRise and get support to do more in my own context.
Cool, thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Callum. Sorry, a bit of feedback with the sound, but it should be all right now. So I work at iRise with Emily and Kushla. I've been helping in the local community to try and organise a coordinated response to make sure everybody who lives nearby can access the facilities and services that they need. We've been connecting up with local food banks and also some of the local charities that are already kind of active in the city, who are kind of working in the same area that I live in, and just kind of trying to build some channels for people to talk to each other, to share about kind of what it is that they're able to offer and what it is that they need and who they need it from, matching up potential volunteers with organisations needing more manpower. And helping some of the kind of the local groups to kind of connect in together. I think there's two specific issues that have come up in our area that are probably relevant to kind of everybody else. The first is that there's a need for sanitary pads. I think food banks, who often have been giving out sanitary pads to those who can't afford them, are struggling to buy them, even when they've got money to buy them. Supermarkets don't have enough stock to sell a bulk order even to a food bank. I think separately, we know that there's kind of a big increase in domestic violence and abuse. And even at the best of times, these people struggle to connect with those who would be able to help. And in the middle of a lockdown, that's all going to be much, much harder. So thinking about how people can find out where to get help and how people can still provide help, even with all of this that's going on. And I think there's also a final kind of relevant area of people who have been needing increased support, which is single mothers who are kind of meant to be working from home. Schools, nurseries are closed. They haven't got access to their usual support networks, and so people like that I think are particularly struggling. And although the government is obviously providing a lot of support, for a lot of people it's not coming quickly enough and it's taking too long to access, so there's a need for some emergency assistance in the meantime. And obviously there's loads of people who the government support isn't enough for anyway, even if they could wait. And unfortunately in the UK that's the case even when there's not a public health emergency going on, so this is only going to make that worse.
Sorry, Callum. Sorry. Specific interventions look like to make this a bit more concrete? So like, sure. Particularly like for domestic abuse, like what does that actually look like?
Sure. Okay. So some of those specific things that people have been working on is there's a group of people who are trying to design some posters that you can print at home on a normal printer that people can put up in their window, just saying this is where you can access help, this is who's still able to offer it. And I guess the hope there would be that although people aren't able to kind of get out and about and access support, they might be able to see across the street. They can see a helpline being displayed in someone's window. We're connecting up with the local organisations that are able to deliver services, particularly on domestic violence, and those that are still able to deliver services. Connecting in with the local council community response teams to make sure that they know who the vulnerable people are. I mean, we all know to a certain extent our own neighbours and family and friends, but not everybody is kind of tied into the official systems, because the social security net in the UK isn't what we would want it to be anyway. So there's people who are kind of off the radar. So connecting up those people with service providers, whether that's charities or the council, trying to share information via kind of whatever channels you can, and trying to get information kind of displayed publicly.
And a good example with the single mothers as well would be a local charity that I've been talking to is talking with us about trying to set up a system where people can volunteer to phone some of these mums they've got on their books, check in, make sure they're okay, and actually then also give these mothers a number to call if they get sick and they can't care for their children, so that they can then call the number and we can try and work something out where there's some form of childcare put in place if they need to go to hospital. So that's like again a very simple thing, but it makes a lot of difference, because I know particularly for this organisation a lot of these mothers are victims of trafficking, and they've come to the UK in really horrific ways. They've now had support, they've settled, but actually they don't have an extensive support network. So getting them paired up with somebody who can just check in on them is really powerful. So I think that's, again, a really simple intervention that iRise is helping to facilitate, and that, you know, that can be done locally.
Yeah, I think those kind of things are going to be easy to replicate in other areas. I think there's also, as Linda's already shared, there's these networks of mutual aid groups kind of all over the country, which is a fantastic thing and resource to connect to. So they're often kind of being organised on Facebook or WhatsApp. I know in Sheffield, where we're based, there's a voluntary group called Voluntary Action Sheffield, which is helping to coordinate all of this. And I think in other towns and cities, there's probably a similar organisation in place that can kind of tell you what's happening in the local area if you're looking for ways to connect in with what's already going on. Yeah, that's that really.
Thank you. Okay. So that's kind of like covering a lot of the assessment and also response. I guess to add to that, if we're thinking about the assessment of your individual communities, and we think about these vulnerable populations, it's really important to think about the sort of dominant intersectionalities of your population. So thinking about what are the dominant sort of religions, what are the, is there like a specific group of LGBTQ plus people that, you know, exist within your community, and thinking what are their usual support channels, going to those support channels and asking, what are you doing at the moment, how can I help? Because often a lot of organizations, they will have already done the work as to where the need is, and so you can go and say, I'm here to help, like where should I place myself, where do you think is the best place to put my time and resources. So that's definitely another thing to consider. I've got some more comments here. Gemma said, the government seems to have shared the details of who is high risk, and 12 weeks shielding with some supermarkets to arrange priority delivery slots. Yeah, which is brilliant. Our local council, Sandwell, is also trying to identify vulnerable people to prioritise support. And Emily said you can access info on our coronavirus response here, and there's a link there. So Emily has just sent in, here are some questions you can use to assess the need in your own community, which I'll also send an email round. Yeah, so it's thinking about what initiatives are already being pursued. Where do you think there's something missing? That's really important, is thinking about what's out there, contacting people, asking what's already being done, and seeing if they need more support or if there is something which is missing from that support network that you can absolutely add value to. So identifying what's missing, identify where perhaps existing support isn't sufficient is important. So if access to products is an issue, organise a product drive. If ensuring women have a safe space to quarantine, perhaps you can raise money for a local women's shelter, or that idea with publishing a number in the window. Yeah, that sounds amazing as well. But if you also, I think as Emily was saying, it's really important to capture the experience of people that's happening right now of these vulnerable groups. So if you feel that vulnerable people's voices aren't being heard, gather those stories, get on Twitter, get on Facebook, and get those stories out there and get people to listen. Because I think that advocacy comes alongside this in terms of what's really important is that we're responding to the needs of our communities right now, and we're doing that directly, but also encouraging other people to do so and to listen and to care as well is also incredibly important. So I think that the main thing is to get in touch with those people that already exist in your community. Don't be afraid to do so. And also, when you think that you've identified perhaps something that's missing, something that needs that extra support, come to us, come to iRise and ask us what we can do to support you in doing that. Because we have certain resources that you can use, and obviously we have like our social media platform, and we're happy to help people within their individual sort of visions for their own communities. We've got another. Yeah, so then thinking about your response, where and how can you add value, talking to existing research groups. Yeah, so there's all of those questions have just been put in the chat. And so I think that for our next webinar, what we really want everyone to do is to investigate the needs of your community specifically, identify who needs support and the best ways of doing this. So have a look at other communities, talk to each other, see what's out there. I know that one of our volunteers, Izzy, she said that there is a number that you can text within her local area if you need period products, and they'll get dropped off outside your home if you need them. So that was a really interesting initiative. I think it was called Periods During Pandemics, something like that. So yeah, have a think about the kind of support you may need from us, and then be ready to sort of share what you found in our next webinar, which will be in 2 weeks' time. And also, if you need support in finding out who needs help in your community, email us. So my email is akushla@irise.org.uk. I'll send that in an email as well. Yeah, and I think that it's just really important that we all know that we can do something about what's going on, and we need to act now rather than later. And even though sort of we have our governments and local councils who, as you say, are doing good work and helping to support those people, we have the same amount of power as well. We have the same amount of agency and leadership to do something about it. So it starts with us. Yeah, so Emily's just added in my email to the chat. Does anyone else have anything they want to add in terms of thinking about how to assess their community, who they might want to contact, who they might thinking about contacting? In terms of like, if you're wanting to talk to existing groups, it's a really good idea to contact schools and food banks and existing women's shelters, and also looking into period shame and poverty initiatives that already exist in your communities, some of which are new. There's a lot of sort of pandemic period policies that are coming out now. So have a look and see what's out there. Don't be afraid to get in touch, and don't be afraid to ask us for help either. So yeah, does anyone else have anything they want to add to this conversation? Anything that they think they need to move on to the next stage? No? Okay, and then Emily and Callum, do you have anything that you want to add?
I'll just say, oh, sorry. Yeah, just to say that thanks everyone for coming, and I think we want to be a resource and a facilitator. I mean, that's IRISE at its best, is that we are a global community, and we're at our best when we're supporting our community to advocate and to kind of lead change. And so we're here to support you guys and our wider community. So use us as a form of support, use us as a resource. I think, it's easy to feel like when you're on your own, you can't do anything, but when you're part of a community, you can do a lot more. So get in touch, for a chat, talking through ideas, anything really. Like we're very much here for our community and to help our community respond positively. So I think don't feel shy about getting in touch. Like nothing you have to say to us it is going to be something that we're not willing to listen to and discuss. So like if you think, oh, I've only got a half-formed idea, or I've got no idea how to do this, but I'm really passionate about this, like, give Akusha an email, give us a call. Like we want to help you kind of go on that journey of thinking about how you can, I suppose, turn this feeling of anxiety into being a really positive agent of change at a very difficult time. So yeah, please remember that we are here for you. And that there's nothing that you can't bring to us basically over the next few weeks, and we'll do everything we can to help and support. And a massive thank you to Akusha, who's doing an amazing job in a very difficult time, and is kind of, I think, doing a very good job of bringing everyone together. So thanks, Akusha.
Thank you. Kerry has also just put in the chat useful numbers in general. So there's Childline, Samaritans, Domestic Violence Hotline, Mind and Age UK there. And the last thing I think I wanted to say is that we've got our second network meeting that's happening tonight at 7:30 p.m. BST. I'll send out another email with the link to join that. What we're really going to be talking about there is we're going to be supporting our emergency campaigns in Uganda and the UK, how we can really support that financially, get some fundraisers going. We've got some really cool and fun ideas for that, and we're happy to have all of you involved. So if you want to discuss that further and also talk a bit more about Menstrual Hygiene Day, which is coming up on the 28th of May, and how we can celebrate that, then then yeah, please come along, and we'd love to see you there at 7:30 tonight. So thank you so much everyone for coming, and good luck.